Right now, someone is choosing to stay in a toxic relationship. Someone else is procrastinating on their dreams while complaining about their current life. And another person is doom-scrolling through depressing news stories, feeling worse with every swipe, yet completely unable to stop. What if I told you that deep down, part of us actually wants to suffer? That we've become so comfortable with pain that we actively seek it out, even when happiness is within reach. Today we're exploring one of psychology's most uncomfortable truths, why human beings have become addicted to their own misery, and how this addiction is quietly destroying our potential for genuine fulfillment. Before we get into this, hit that subscribe button to Marjan Al-Nahlar if you're ready to challenge everything you thought you knew about human psychology. And drop a comment below with the next topic you'd love me to explore. Your suggestions literally shape these videos. Now let's talk about why we're so drawn to our own suffering. Think about the last time someone offered you genuine help with a problem you'd been complaining about for months. Did you take it? Or did you find reasons why their solution wouldn't work? Most people choose the latter, and there's a disturbing psychological reason why. We've trained ourselves to find comfort in the very suffering we claim to want to escape. Your brain doesn't distinguish between good familiar and bad familiar. It just knows what feels safe. That toxic job you hate? Your brain has mapped every emotional pothole, every stress response, every disappointment. It knows exactly how to navigate that misery. But that new opportunity that could change everything, that's unknown territory. And your brain treats unknown territory like a potential threat, even when it's actually salvation. This is why people stay in relationships that drain them, why they choose familiar financial struggle over unfamiliar business risks, and why they'll sabotage their own success right when things start looking up. The devil you know feels safer than the angel you don't, even when the devil is systematically destroying your life. Sarah had been complaining about her marriage for 3 years. Every conversation with friends ended up being a therapy session about her husband's emotional unavailability. When her friend finally suggested couples therapy, Sarah's immediate response was a list of reasons why it wouldn't work. When another friend suggested she might be happier alone, Sarah became defensive. The truth wasn't that Sarah wanted to fix her marriage. She wanted to keep suffering in a predictable way. We become psychological hoarders, collecting our grievances and trauma responses like treasured possessions. Each familiar ache becomes a security blanket. We know exactly how heartbreak feels, exactly how rejection tastes, exactly how disappointment sits in our chest. These sensations become home base in a world that otherwise feels chaotic and unpredictable. The addiction to suffering operates on the same neurochemical principles as substance addiction. Every time we revisit our pain, replay our victimizations, or engage in self-defeating behaviors, our brain releases a cocktail of stress hormones and neurotransmitters that create a familiar high. We become chemically dependent on our own drama. Consider how you feel when everything in your life is going well. For many people, sustained happiness creates anxiety. They start waiting for the other shoe to drop, looking for problems that don't exist, or unconsciously creating chaos to return to their emotional baseline. This isn't coincidence, it's addiction withdrawal. When we're not suffering, we don't know who we are. Your nervous system has adapted to function in crisis mode. The constant low-level stress of familiar suffering keeps your adrenaline and cortisol at levels your body now considers normal. When life becomes peaceful, your system goes into withdrawal, creating anxiety, restlessness, and the compulsive need to create problems. You literally feel more comfortable when you're fighting some battle, nursing some wound, or carrying some burden. This explains why people unconsciously sabotage relationships right when they're getting serious, why they quit jobs just before promotions, or why they create arguments out of nothing when life gets too peaceful. The suffering addiction needs its fix, and if life isn't providing natural drama, the addicted mind will manufacture it. Watch how people talk about their problems. Listen to the energy in their voice when they describe their latest crisis versus when they talk about good news. There's often more passion, more engagement, more aliveness in the recounting of suffering than in the sharing of joy. We've learned to perform our pain because it gets us attention, sympathy, and most importantly, it confirms our familiar identity as someone who struggles. The most insidious part of this addiction is how it masquerades as depth, authenticity, or emotional intelligence. We tell ourselves that happy people are naive, that suffering makes us more interesting, that our pain gives us character. But there's a difference between wisdom earned through necessary pain and addiction to unnecessary suffering. Breaking free from the comfort zone of pain requires recognizing that suffering has become your drug of choice. Like any addiction, the first step is admitting there's a problem. But this admission is particularly challenging because our culture has romanticized suffering as noble, meaningful, and necessary for growth. Start paying attention to your emotional patterns. Notice when you feel most alive. Is it during crisis or during peace? Do you find yourself creating problems when life gets too calm? Do you unconsciously seek out news, conversations, or situations that confirm your worst fears about life? These are the behavioral signatures of suffering addiction. The withdrawal from suffering addiction feels like boredom, emptiness, or loss of identity. When you stop feeding on drama, crisis, and familiar pain, there's initially a void where all that emotional intensity used to live. This void is not permanent, but your brain will try to convince you it is. It will whisper that you're becoming complacent, boring, or disconnected from reality. Building tolerance for joy requires the same patience and commitment as recovering from any other addiction. You have to retrain your nervous system to recognize peace as safe, happiness as sustainable, and progress as possible. This means consciously choosing the unfamiliar path even when every instinct screams for the familiar suffering. Start small. Choose the optimistic interpretation of ambiguous situations instead of assuming the worst. Resist the urge to rehearse potential catastrophes. When someone offers help, try saying yes before listing why it won't work. When life is going well, practice staying present instead of waiting for disaster. The goal isn't to never experience pain. Pain is inevitable and often necessary for growth. The goal is to stop seeking out unnecessary suffering, stop clinging to old wounds, and stop using familiar misery as a substitute for unknown happiness. Real strength isn't about how much pain you can endure. It's about having the courage to release suffering that no longer serves you, and embrace a life that feels unfamiliarly good. Every family dinner, every workplace conflict, every social media argument follows the same predictable script. Someone plays the victim, someone else jumps in as the rescuer, and inevitably, someone becomes the persecutor. Then, like a twisted game of musical chairs, everyone switches roles. Welcome to the drama triangle, the most addictive psychological pattern in human relationships. The drama triangle was first identified by psychiatrist Stephen Karpman, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. It explains why your friend keeps dating the same type of person, why your coworker always has a crisis that needs solving, and why family gatherings feel like psychological warfare zones. Each role provides a different type of emotional drug, and we rotate between them like addicts seeking their next fix. The victim gets sympathy, attention, and freedom from responsibility. They're never at fault, always wronged, perpetually powerless. This role feels safe because it requires no risk, no change, no accountability. The victim's mantra is, "Why does this always happen to me?" But they unconsciously arrange their lives to ensure it keeps happening, because the alternative, taking responsibility for their choices, feels more terrifying than continued suffering. The rescuer gets to feel important, needed, and morally superior. They swoop in to save the day, fix everyone's problems, and bask in the gratitude. But rescuers aren't helping, they're enabling. They need people to stay broken so they can continue feeling valuable. Their help often creates more dependency, not less, because their identity depends on others staying helpless. The persecutor gets to feel powerful and righteous. They're the ones pointing out everyone else's flaws, holding people accountable, often brutally, and delivering harsh truths. They convince themselves they're doing everyone a favor by being the realistic one, but they're really feeding off the emotional charge of conflict and superiority. Here's the insidious part. We tell ourselves we hate these dynamics while actively participating in them. The victim complains about being persecuted while unconsciously provoking the persecutor. The rescuer complains about always having to save everyone while seeking out people who need saving. The persecutor complains about everyone being weak while systematically undermining people's confidence. The drama triangle operates in our internal dialogue just as powerfully as it does in our relationships. You have an inner victim that whines about how unfair life is, an inner rescuer that makes excuses for your behavior, and an inner persecutor that constantly criticizes and judges yourself and others. This internal triangle keeps you trapped in cycles of self-sabotage and emotional chaos. Watch how your mind processes setbacks. The inner victim immediately starts the "poor me" narrative. Life is hard, you never catch a break, everyone else has it easier. Then the inner rescuer jumps in with rationalization and excuses. It's not your fault, you couldn't have known, circumstances were against you. Finally, the inner persecutor attacks. You're stupid, you should have seen this coming, you never learn. This internal cycling creates an addictive emotional roller coaster that keeps you stuck in familiar patterns of suffering. Each role provides a different neurochemical hit. The victim gets the stress hormones and sympathy-seeking behaviors. The rescuer gets the dopamine of feeling needed and important. The persecutor gets the adrenaline rush of righteous anger and judgment. Social media has turned the drama triangle into a global addiction. Every controversial post is designed to trigger these roles. People compete to be the biggest victim of social injustice, the most heroic rescuer of various causes, or the most savage persecutor of those they disagree with. We're all performing our roles for an audience, getting likes and comments that reinforce whichever triangle position we're currently occupying. The most sophisticated drama triangle addicts have learned to play all three roles simultaneously. They present themselves as victims of circumstances, while rescuing others from similar situations and persecuting anyone who suggests they might have some agency in their own lives. This triple threat performance maximizes the emotional payoff while making them nearly impossible to help or reason with. Breaking the triangle requires recognizing when you're in it and choosing to step out rather than switch roles. But this is incredibly difficult because stepping out means giving up the emotional intensity, the clear identity, and the neurochemical rewards that keep the drama addiction fed. The most dangerous aspect of the drama triangle is how it masquerades as genuine emotion and authentic relationships. We mistake intensity for intimacy, conflict for passion, and chaos for aliveness. People in healthy relationships seem boring to drama triangle addicts because healthy relationships don't provide the same emotional highs and lows. Real intimacy requires vulnerability without victimhood, support without rescuing, and honesty without persecution. But these healthy dynamics feel flat and uninteresting to people addicted to triangle dynamics. They'll unconsciously sabotage healthy relationships or create drama where none exists to get their fix of familiar emotional intensity. The drama triangle also explains why some people seem to attract the same problems repeatedly. The victim attracts persecutors and rescuers. The rescuer attracts victims and eventually becomes a persecutor when their help isn't appreciated. The persecutor attracts victims and rescuers who enable their behavior. Each role magnetizes the other roles, creating self-reinforcing cycles of dysfunction. Breaking free requires developing what psychologists call emotional sobriety, the ability to experience life without the artificial highs and lows of manufactured drama. This means learning to tolerate the absence of crisis, the presence of stability, and the responsibility that comes with stepping out of the triangle roles. Instead of being a victim, you become a creator, taking responsibility for your choices and their consequences. Instead of being a rescuer, you become a supporter, helping others while maintaining healthy boundaries and expecting them to do their own work. Instead of being a persecutor, you become an honest communicator, speaking truth without cruelty and holding boundaries without attacks. The withdrawal from drama triangle addiction feels like emotional flatness initially. Without the artificial intensity of victim-rescuer-persecutor dynamics, life can seem dull or meaningless. But this is temporary. Once your nervous system recalibrates, you discover that genuine emotions are actually more satisfying than manufactured drama. Real intimacy runs deeper than intensity. True strength comes from stability, not chaos. The goal isn't to never experience conflict or challenges. It's to stop creating unnecessary drama and to engage with real challenges from a place of empowerment rather than from addiction to familiar suffering patterns. Open any social media platform right now, and you'll find people competing in an invisible Olympics where the medals go to whoever can demonstrate the most suffering, the most oppression, or the most tragic backstory. We've gamified our pain, turned trauma into social currency, and created platforms where misery gets more engagement than joy. The algorithm doesn't reward happiness, it rewards engagement, and nothing drives engagement like outrage, fear, and shared suffering. Every platform has learned that angry people scroll longer, devastated people share more, and traumatized people create the most compelling content. We are being systematically trained to perform our pain for an audience of strangers who reward our suffering with hearts, likes, and sympathetic comments. This has created a perverse incentive structure where healing becomes economically and socially disadvantageous. If your entire online identity is built around being a survivor of something, what happens to your follower count when you actually heal? If your personal brand depends on sharing your struggle, how do you maintain relevance when life gets better? Watch how differently people respond to posts about struggles versus posts about success. Share a breakdown, and you'll get hundreds of supportive comments. Share a breakthrough, and you might get a few polite congratulations. The disparity is stark and telling. We've collectively agreed that suffering is more interesting, more relatable, and more worthy of our attention than triumph. The Suffering Olympics has categories for every type of pain. There's competitive trauma, who had the worst childhood; competitive mental illness, who's more authentically depressed; competitive oppression, who faces more systemic barriers; competitive exhaustion, who's more overwhelmed by life's demands. Winners get sympathy, validation, and most importantly, they get to feel special in their pain. But here's the twisted psychology. The more we perform our suffering for others, the more attached we become to it. Every sympathetic comment reinforces our identity as someone who struggles. Every shared trauma story deepens our neural pathways of suffering. Every outrage post we make or engage with floods our system with stress hormones that our brain starts to crave. We're literally training ourselves to seek out and amplify suffering because that's what gets rewarded in our digital ecosystem. Social media has also weaponized comparison in ways that guarantee suffering. Everyone else's highlight reel makes your behind the scenes look pathetic by comparison, but instead of recognizing this obvious truth, we double down on documenting our struggles to compete in the opposite direction. If you can't win at having the best life, you can win at having the worst problems. The comparison game has evolved beyond material success into competitive victimhood. People scroll through feeds feeling inadequate not just because others seem happier or more successful, but because others seem to suffer more authentically, more dramatically, or more deservingly. This creates a bizarre form of imposter syndrome where people feel like their problems aren't real enough, their trauma isn't severe enough, or their struggles aren't valid enough. This leads to what psychologists call trauma inflation, the unconscious exaggeration or amplification of our difficulties to meet the social media standard of what constitutes real suffering. People start reframing normal life challenges as traumatic experiences, everyday disappointments as devastating setbacks, and minor interpersonal conflicts as abusive relationships. Not because they're lying, but because the platform rewards this interpretation. The dopamine hit of viral suffering is incredibly addictive. When your post about your mental health struggle gets thousands of likes and hundreds of supportive comments, it creates a neurochemical reward that your brain wants to recreate. You start unconsciously crafting your life experiences into content, viewing your pain through the lens of potential engagement rather than potential healing. This creates a feedback loop where social media users become psychologically invested in maintaining their suffering because their online identity and social connections depend on it. Healing becomes a threat to relevance. Getting better means losing your audience. Recovery means returning to invisibility. The most insidious part is how this masquerades as community and support. Yes, people are offering genuine sympathy and encouragement, but they're also enabling the performance of pain and inadvertently discouraging actual recovery. The person who keeps posting about the same problem for months isn't getting help. They're getting an audience, and there's a crucial difference. Breaking free from social media's suffering addiction requires recognizing how the platforms have hijacked your brain's reward systems. Every notification activates the same neural pathways as gambling. You never know whether you'll get the jackpot of viral sympathy or the disappointment of being ignored. This intermittent reinforcement schedule is the most addictive pattern known to psychology. Start paying attention to your posting patterns. Do you share more about problems or solutions? Do you get more engagement when you're struggling or when you're thriving? Are you unconsciously crafting your experiences into content before you've even fully processed them? These awareness practices reveal how deeply the performance of suffering has invaded your authentic experience. The withdrawal from social media suffering addiction involves sitting with your pain without immediately reaching for your phone to share it. It means experiencing joy without needing to document it. It means processing trauma privately or with actual professional help rather than crowdsourcing your healing to strangers who benefit from your continued struggle. This doesn't mean never sharing authentic struggles or celebrating genuine victories. It means developing the awareness to distinguish between sharing that serves your actual healing and sharing that feeds your suffering addiction. Healthy sharing connects you to real support and moves you toward resolution. Addictive sharing keeps you stuck in the problem while providing the illusion of progress. Consider taking periodic breaks from consuming other people's suffering content. Notice how much better you feel when you're not constantly absorbing everyone else's trauma, outrage, and crisis. Your nervous system isn't designed to carry the weight of global suffering. Yet social media makes us feel guilty for not being constantly devastated by every tragedy and injustice worldwide. The goal isn't to become callous or disconnected from real problems. It's to develop the discernment to engage with suffering, your own and others, in ways that actually lead to healing rather than perpetuating cycles of addiction. Real community supports your growth out of pain, not your continued performance of it. When you stop competing in the suffering Olympics, you discover that life without constant drama, crisis, and trauma performance is not boring. It's peaceful, and peace is the foundation for everything meaningful you want to build. The most terrifying moment for someone addicted to suffering is not when things go wrong. It's when things start going right. Because buried beneath years of complaints about their problems is a secret fear. If I'm not struggling, who am I? We build entire identities around our wounds, our limitations, and our familiar patterns of suffering, and then we become terrified to heal, because healing would mean becoming a stranger to ourselves. This is why people unconsciously sabotage therapy right when breakthroughs happen. Why they quit healthy relationships just when intimacy deepens. Why they abandon positive habits just when they start working. The suffering addiction runs so deep that recovery feels like death. The death of the only self they've ever known. Consider Maria, who spent 10 years in therapy talking about her childhood trauma. She could analyze every aspect of her dysfunctional family, explain exactly how her patterns formed, and articulate sophisticated insights about her emotional wounds. But whenever her therapist suggested she might be ready to move beyond processing the past into creating a different future, Maria would find new traumas to explore, new layers of damage to uncover, new reasons why she wasn't ready for change. Maria wasn't failing at therapy. She was succeeding at staying safely imprisoned in familiar pain. Her identity as someone healing from trauma had become more comfortable than the unknown territory of someone who is healed. The therapy itself had become another form of suffering addiction, a sophisticated way to stay connected to her wounds while appearing to work on them. This identity prison explains why some people collect diagnoses like badges of honor, why others seem to acquire new problems as soon as old ones resolve, and why certain individuals become professional victims who turn every conversation into a recitation of their struggles. The suffering isn't just something that happens to them. It's who they are. The scariest part of breaking free from suffering addiction is not the fear that life won't get better. It's the fear that life will get better, and then you'll have to figure out who you are without your familiar pain to define you. The identity prison operates through what psychologists call secondary gains, the hidden benefits we get from our problems that make us unconsciously reluctant to solve them. These gains are rarely obvious or consciously acknowledged, but they're powerful enough to keep intelligent, capable people stuck in patterns that seem obviously self-destructive to outside observers. The chronically anxious person gets to avoid taking risks that might lead to failure or rejection. The perpetually overwhelmed person gets to feel important and needed while avoiding deep work or meaningful relationships. The person with chronic health issues gets sympathy, care, and freedom from certain responsibilities. The financially struggling artist gets to feel authentic and uncommercial while avoiding the vulnerability of actually marketing their work. None of these people consciously choose their struggles, but part of them unconsciously resists losing what those struggles provide. This creates an internal conflict where they genuinely want to get better, while simultaneously sabotaging their own progress to preserve the familiar benefits of their problems. The most sophisticated form of this identity prison is what therapists call spiritual bypassing, using healing concepts and personal growth language to maintain suffering in a more acceptable form. People become addicted to the process of healing rather than actually healing. They collect modalities, attend workshops, read books, and engage in endless self-analysis while remaining fundamentally unchanged. This is unconscious manipulation. It's an unconscious defense mechanism against the terror of losing a familiar identity. The person genuinely believes they want to heal, but their definition of healing has been hijacked to mean perpetually working on healing, rather than actually becoming whole. The identity prison is reinforced by how others relate to us. Friends and family members often unconsciously prefer us to stay in familiar roles. They know how to interact with Sarah the anxious one, or Tom the struggling artist. When Sarah becomes confident or Tom becomes successful, it disrupts established relationship dynamics and forces everyone to relate differently. This social reinforcement makes breaking free even more challenging because healing doesn't just require changing how you see yourself. It requires changing how everyone else sees you too. Breaking free from the identity prison requires the courage to discover who you are without your familiar suffering. This is perhaps the most profound form of personal transformation because it requires releasing not just your problems, but your attachment to the identity those problems have created. The process begins with brutal honesty about the secondary gains your suffering provides. What do you get from your anxiety that confidence might not provide? What does depression give you that joy wouldn't? What benefits come from being overwhelmed that organization and efficiency might eliminate? These questions aren't meant to blame or shame. They're meant to illuminate the unconscious contracts you've made with suffering. Recovery requires developing what we might call identity flexibility, the ability to see yourself as larger than your current patterns, problems, or psychological profile. This means practicing describing yourself in terms of your values, aspirations, and capabilities rather than your struggles, diagnoses, or limitations. Instead of, "I'm someone with anxiety," try, "I'm someone learning to trust life." Instead of, "I'm a trauma survivor," try, "I'm someone creating new possibilities." The most challenging part of this identity shift is learning to tolerate the discomfort of not knowing who you are. There's a period in recovery where your old identity no longer fits, but your new identity hasn't fully formed. This liminal space feels vulnerable and uncertain, but it's also where transformation happens. You'll need to grieve the loss of your familiar self, even if that self was suffering. There's genuine loss in releasing an identity you've carried for years, even if that identity was built around pain. Allow yourself to feel sad about saying goodbye to the version of yourself that struggled, while also celebrating the version that's emerging. The goal isn't to pretend you never struggled or to minimize real pain you've experienced. It's to stop defining yourself by your worst moments, your deepest wounds, or your most challenging patterns. You are not your trauma. You are not your anxiety. You are not your depression. You are the consciousness that can observe all of these experiences and choose how to respond to them. True healing happens when you become more interested in who you're becoming than in who you've been. Breaking free from suffering addiction isn't about positive thinking or pretending pain doesn't exist. It's about developing a completely different relationship with both pleasure and pain. Like any addiction recovery, it requires recognizing the substance you're addicted to, understanding your triggers, and building new neural pathways that support healthier patterns. The first step is developing what we call suffering awareness, the ability to catch yourself in the act of choosing unnecessary pain. This means noticing when you're rehearsing worst-case scenarios, when you're seeking out information that confirms your fears, or when you're unconsciously creating problems to solve. Most suffering addicts are so deep in their patterns that they don't realize they're actively participating in their own misery. Start tracking your emotional patterns like a scientist studying your own behavior. When do you feel most alive? During crisis or during calm? What topics do you gravitate toward in conversations, problems, or possibilities? Do you find yourself disappointed when conflicts resolve easily, or when anticipated disasters don't materialize? These observations reveal the subtle ways suffering has become your drug of choice. The withdrawal from suffering addiction creates what feels like emotional flatness or boredom. Without the familiar intensity of drama, crisis, and emotional turbulence, life can seem dull or meaningless. This is your nervous system going through detox. Just like someone withdrawing from stimulants might feel depressed and lethargic, someone withdrawing from suffering addiction might feel disconnected from life's meaning. But this flatness is temporary. Your brain has simply forgotten how to generate satisfaction from peace, joy, and stability because it's been addicted to the neurochemical cocktail of stress hormones and crisis mode functioning. Recovery means retraining your system to find life interesting without constant drama. Building tolerance for happiness requires the same patience and commitment as any rehabilitation process. You have to consciously choose pleasure, peace, and positive outcomes, even when they feel foreign or uncomfortable. This means celebrating small wins instead of minimizing them, choosing optimistic interpretations of ambiguous situations, and resisting the urge to create problems when life gets too good. The goal isn't to become naively positive or to avoid all discomfort. It's to stop using familiar suffering as a substitute for unknown joy. Practical recovery from suffering addiction involves rewiring your brain's reward system to find satisfaction in growth, peace, and genuine achievement, rather than in crisis, drama, and familiar pain. This neuroplasticity work requires conscious, repeated practice of new patterns until they become as automatic as your old suffering patterns once were. One of the most powerful techniques is pleasure tolerance training, consciously extending your capacity to experience and appreciate positive emotions without immediately seeking balance through suffering. When something good happens, resist the urge to worry about when it will end, to find problems with it, or to minimize its significance. Practice staying present with joy, gratitude, and satisfaction for increasingly longer periods. Another crucial practice is emotional regulation without drama, learning to process difficult emotions without turning them into identity-defining crises. When you feel sad, angry, or afraid, practice experiencing these emotions fully, without creating stories about what they mean about your life, your relationships, or your future. Emotions can be intense without being traumatic, temporary without being meaningless. Develop what we call solution-focused attention, training your mind to spend more time thinking about what you want than about what you don't want. Suffering addicts have typically trained their brains to be expert problem finders and threat detectors. Recovery means consciously redirecting that mental energy toward possibility finding and opportunity detection. This doesn't mean ignoring real problems or avoiding necessary challenges. It means stopping the compulsive mental rehearsal of difficulties, the obsessive analysis of what could go wrong, and the addictive focus on everything that's missing or broken in your life. Create suffering interrupts. Specific practices you use when you catch yourself falling into addictive suffering patterns. This might be physical movement, creative expression, connection with nature, or conscious breathing. The key is having predetermined alternatives ready, so you're not trying to white-knuckle your way out of suffering patterns through willpower alone. Remember that recovery isn't linear. You'll have relapses into familiar suffering patterns, especially during stressful periods. The goal isn't perfection, it's progress. Each time you choose a healthier response, you're strengthening new neural pathways and weakening old ones. The final stage of recovery from suffering addiction involves building a life so genuinely fulfilling that suffering becomes obviously unappealing by comparison. This means discovering what actually brings you sustainable satisfaction, rather than just temporary relief from emotional discomfort. Most suffering addicts have never learned to distinguish between authentic desires and addiction-driven cravings. They chase intensity because they've forgotten what genuine contentment feels like. Recovery involves rediscovering your authentic preferences, values, and sources of meaning that exist independent of your suffering patterns. This often requires grieving the time, energy, and opportunities that were lost to suffering addiction. There's real loss here: relationships that were damaged by your addiction to drama, goals that were abandoned because healing felt threatening, experiences that were missed because crisis seemed more compelling than joy. Allow yourself to feel sadness about these losses without falling back into familiar patterns of self-blame or victimization. Building a life beyond suffering addiction means developing genuine sources of self-worth that are not dependent on overcoming obstacles, fixing problems, or surviving difficulties. This might involve creative expression, meaningful relationships, contribution to something larger than yourself, or the simple pleasure of being present with life as it unfolds naturally. The most important skill in recovery is learning to trust that life can be good without being dramatic, meaningful without being difficult, and interesting without being chaotic. Suffering addicts often fear that happiness will make them complacent, naive, or shallow. The truth is that genuine contentment provides a stable foundation for addressing real challenges more effectively than constant crisis mode functioning ever could. Recovery from suffering addiction ultimately means choosing to participate in life from curiosity rather than from fear, from possibility rather than from scarcity, and from trust rather than from the need to control outcomes through familiar suffering patterns. The person you become without your addiction to suffering is not a stranger. It's who you've always been underneath the layers of familiar pain. Recovery isn't about becoming someone new. It's about removing everything that was never authentically you and allowing your natural state of well-being to emerge. And that person, it turns out, is far more interesting, capable, and alive than the suffering version ever was. So here we are. We've explored one of the most uncomfortable truths about human psychology, that many of us have become addicted to our own suffering, choosing familiar pain over unknown joy, drama over peace, and crisis over contentment. We've seen how this addiction operates through the comfort zone of pain, the drama triangle dynamics in our relationships, the gamification of suffering on social media, the identity prisons we build around our wounds, and most importantly, how to break free from these patterns. The hardest part about recognizing suffering addiction is not admitting that you have problems. It's admitting that part of you does not want to solve them, that somewhere in your unconscious mind, you've made peace with pain because it feels safer than the vulnerability of joy, that you've trained your nervous system to find life interesting only when it's difficult, meaningful only when it's dramatic, and authentic only when it's painful. But here's what I want you to understand. Choosing to heal from suffering addiction isn't about becoming naive, shallow, or disconnected from reality. It's about becoming powerful enough to handle life's real challenges without needing to create artificial ones. It's about developing the courage to be happy even when happiness feels foreign, to trust peace even when peace feels boring, and to embrace your potential even when potential feels terrifying. The person you are without your addiction to suffering isn't someone you need to become. It's someone you already are underneath all the familiar patterns of pain. Recovery isn't about transformation as much as it's about revelation. You're not broken and in need of fixing. You're whole and in need of remembering. Your suffering addiction served a purpose once. It helped you survive experiences that genuinely required survival mode. It gave you identity when identity felt fragile. It provided connection when connection felt impossible. But what helped you survive your past might be preventing you from thriving in your present. The choice is yours. You can continue participating in the suffering Olympics, competing for who has the most legitimate pain and the most compelling problems. You can keep cycling through the drama triangle, collecting sympathy as a victim, validation as a rescuer, or righteousness as a persecutor. You can maintain your identity prison, staying safely defined by your wounds rather than courageously exploring your wholeness. Or you can choose something different, something scarier and more uncertain, but ultimately more alive. If this resonated with you, if you recognized yourself in these patterns and you're ready to explore what life might look like without your familiar suffering, I want to hear from you. Subscribe to Marjan Al-Nalar if you haven't already, because we're going to keep exploring these uncomfortable psychological truths that nobody else wants to talk about. But more than that, I want you to take one small step today toward breaking your own suffering addiction. Maybe that's choosing not to scroll through anxiety-inducing news. Maybe it's resisting the urge to create a problem when life gets too peaceful. Maybe it's allowing yourself to feel genuinely happy about something good in your life without immediately searching for what's wrong with it. And drop a comment below sharing what topic you'd like me to explore next. Your suggestions shape these conversations, and honestly, some of the best insights come from what you're struggling with or curious about. Whether it's relationships, success, fear, authenticity, or any other aspect of the human experience. I want to know what questions are keeping you up at night. Remember, the goal isn't to never experience pain. Pain is inevitable and often necessary for growth. The goal is to stop choosing unnecessary suffering over available joy, to stop performing your pain for an audience of people who benefit from your continued struggle, to stop defining yourself by your worst moments instead of your infinite potential. Your suffering addiction might have been your survival strategy, but it doesn't have to be your life sentence. You have the power to choose differently, and that choice starts right now.